If you're a fan of Hunter x Hunter or not, you've probably been exposed to some heated debates, and probably seen your fair share of video comparisons. The thing is, it's usually just footage chucked up side by side with some incredibly high quality footage that totally doesn't look like it's been filmed through a million flip phones. So I thought they both deserve an actual analysis. I mean, apparently this is the greatest shonen of all time, so it's kinda due. So firstly, let's get the details out of the way. 1. This episode is not actually animated by Madhouse. Yes, I know, but it was outsourced to Dr. Movie. Yes, that is indeed the name. They are partnered though with Madhouse and have worked closely with the company for decades at this point. Now, the 99 version isn't produced by Nippon Animation either. The 99 adaptation's animation was entirely outsourced to other studios, such as Production IG. You know, the studio behind a little movie called Ghost in the Shell, and in the past decade another very obscure show, Attack on Titan. But it isn't IG which handled this one, but rather Studio Gene and Studio Mu, with Shinobu Takashira being the animation supervisor. As the name implies, they supervise the episode's animation, and if needed will make corrections to the key animator's drawings, whether it's in an effort to just improve the overall draftsmanship or to the actual animation itself. And on the 2011 side, you had two supervisors, Boo-hee Lee and Min-sop Shin. Unfortunately, the only thing you'll get when you punch their names into Google is K-drama, not exactly the most helpful search result. And final mention is that animator Noria Matsumoto is pretty involved in the 99 one. Some of his most famous work is Rock Lee vs Gaara and Sasuke vs Naruto. He was very much one of the top animators on that show. Coincidentally, who we also went over in depth recently, wink wink, please check that video out. He's one of the greatest action animators in the industry, next to names like Yutaka Nakamura and Yoshimichi Kamada. So you can bet it's great to have a legend like him here. But with that though, let's dive into the video. I've mentioned several of the staff for these episodes, but the most important of all is the series director, Kazuhiro Furuhashi. His importance in defining the overall aesthetic to the show cannot be stated enough. Furuhashi's always been a flexible director, from comedies like Ranma to Rurouni Kenshin, and his recent work on Spy Family shows that's a feature that's never changed. What remains most consistent of all though, is his success of portraying the beauty of the world these characters live in, while equally being able to convey the darker undertones. Hunter x Hunter isn't just some bright happy tale, it's often filled with violence and brutal in its depiction of it. Of course, an understanding of that is great, but it's rather his ability to enhance it which fuels this show, and that's very much the defining trait of this episode. Although he doesn't directly handle this one, it would be one of the series' second best regulars, Tsukasa Sunaga, and who embraces Furuhashi's vision to the point I can't help but wonder if some of these creative choices are his. One of the first is the use of a day cycle. This isn't present in the manga or the 2011 edition, but definitely fits into Furuhashi's realistic sensibilities, and existed in the majority of episodes he directed. The episode seems to start around midday, but gradually throughout you can see a change in the position of the sun, and towards the climax it's a warm afternoon. The colours work perfectly in creating a distinctive contrast in the atmosphere to everything before. It's a visual cue to indicate significance to this moment. Now, the source material does indicate that this fight has gone on for some time, and that mention isn't excluded here either, but the anime wants to not just deliver that information verbally, but visually as well. You can see the sense of realism in other areas, and with it again involving the background art, a severely overlooked feature that doesn't get enough praise. Oftentimes, background art in TV anime is treated as a static object. Now, whether through Furuhashi making a direct comment to Sunaga or not, there's an attempt to go against that norm. In several cuts, the clouds are animated travelling across the sky, even through reflections they appear. Is it consistent the whole way through? No, but it shows an attempt to make the environment these characters are in all the more alive. But that feature of something feeling alive extends out beyond just the direction but to the animation itself. And that starts with action ace Noria Matsumoto. Although I wouldn't define Matsumoto as a purist when it comes to realism, it's undeniable it's a core feature of his work. Matsumoto breathes life into whatever character he selected to animate. They're filled with nuanced movement and expressions. And even though Matsumoto is better known for his strong action scenes, Make no mistake that his roots reside in character animation, with the other coming later on in his career, and his work here shows why he's an expert at both. In terms of atmosphere, it's already set. Fairly tense tracks have played, with clever framing that quickly immerses you into this world. Right from the first cut to signal this fight, Matsumoto's work is unmistakable. The subtle change in the position of the character's fingers before coming down, overlapping action with the suit and shirt, overshoot to give more weight to the hands, then having the camera track his hand rather than a static shot, and of course smears, which are continuously used throughout this whole scene, used to make the motion looser and illustrate speed. Like any series he's on, he goes off model to make the characters easier to animate. Designs are rounded and simplified, and use far less line and shading. You can notice in comparison to the following scenes, the anatomy of the ear uses only 3 lines, and Gon has more of a rounder jaw. A stark contrast to Supervisor Takashira's style, whose art carries a distinct sharpness to facial features, often detailing folds of skin with intricate and realistic shading, and generally uses more tones. Despite many of the other staff being quite heavily corrected, Matsumoto slips by mostly untouched. What's interesting is that the source material now has this fight last about 5 panels, but Sunaga and Matsumoto want to make this a little more exhilarating. Now instead of Hanzo just zooming up to Gon and ending it with a hit, he instead frantically darts away. When Hanzo catches up, the camera angle obscures his face, giving a sinister feel with his body language and expressions, showing to the viewer that he's still got the upper hand, and builds suspense before his next move. Not too surprisingly, the speedy ninja instantly catches up. Gon desperately tries to get away again, jumping and running across the wall now. This is also a clever use of the environment and makes for a more interesting fight. Gon still can't manage to get away though, even in the air. When he springs back with a kick, Hanzo shows his superiority by balancing on his foot, and as Gon goes to follow it up with a punch, Hanzo lands the strike. What's worth pointing out first is the storyboard. It provides a strong variety of perspectives throughout the entire scene. A first-person shot as Gon spins around, a high shot as he falls down. It's all perfectly composed in a way that's never boring but not hard to follow either. The second is the feeling of depth communicated through the animation, with Gon often running opposite to the camera. But the cut on the wall is the most impressive example of all. It starts off as a low angle with the camera tilted, but what makes it more tricky is how it switches from a low tracking shot into an overhead one. Not only is the angle changing, requiring strong knowledge or perspective on Matsumoto's part, but you're having to keep the volume of the character intact as the camera slowly zooms out, and while also having to animate the background, and quite a detailed one at that with intricate wall patterns. And the final point is the bouncy energy to Gon's movements. He never stops moving once, and when he does slow down, he spins around through the air. The timing for a lot of these actions is on ones, which pairs together in giving this sudden burst of fluidity to the animation. It's fun and stylish. Overall, in both versions, the core message is that Hanzo is in a completely different league than Gon, and that definitely isn't lost by extending this fight out by an extra 30 seconds or so. If anything, these additions illustrate that message even further in how Hanzo plays around with him, instantly running beside Gon, and just when he thinks he's got away, Hanzo's right back there taunting him. I mentioned earlier though, Matsumoto's character animation is equally impressive, and that brings us to this beatdown. As you would expect, there are extra additions made. In the original, Hanzo is crouched behind him with his hand placed on his shoulder, telling him to give it up, just say the word. Of course, Gon's on a mission and there's no way he's going to give up yet. So he receives a strike to the head. Again, Hanzo instructs him to surrender. He'll have his chance in the next match. Of course, Gon refuses and receives another hit. It's not directly shown, but it seems to be enough to have him laying flat on the ground. The anime takes it a step further. After receiving the slap and Gon's refusal, Hanzo instead grabs him by the head. The storyboard is also much closer in its composition, which amplifies the tension. Much like the original, he receives a blow off screen, but this time with a simple cold expression by Hisoka as you hear Gon coughing in pain. Instead of ending it there, Hanzo asks again for the third time. Gon, even in this position, still doesn't back down, resulting in Hanzo slamming his face into the cold ground. There's a pause, then blood begins to come from his nose. Hanzo's building frustration is much more evident through his actions here, starting off composed with his hand on Gon's shoulder, to then grabbing his head, and Gon's refusal to give up after this amount of brutality gives more emotional weight and power to his resistance. and this extra level of intensity is all throughout this episode. Another example is in the manga in the 2011 adaptation. Hanzo tells Gon that the strike he landed was hard enough to make his brain bounce around. Here, he mentions that he struck the stem of his brain, and it's presented as a lingering effect rather than just a generic hard hit that he shakes off. Not too soon after, he gets back on his feet, Matsumoto removes the highlights off his eyes, and changes the size of the pupils to show the damage beginning to take effect. This next shot on the storyboard is also clever. It uses perspective to indicate how he feels now through its warped nature. This type of shot is also referred to as a fisheyes lens, and you can see a similar one not too long after. Just the perspective alone illustrates Gon's internal damage. Outside of this scene, there are many more minor additions, through both the writing and storyboard, which leave a strong impression. A top-down shot of Hanzo with a large shadow covering Gon's still body, expressing a sense of absolute superiority. As Liario yells out to switch places, he draws blood from biting his lip, an extra detail to make his frustration more felt. Another is Gon having one of his ears crushed, as he was using his sense of hearing to attack Hanzo, explaining why Gon was still able to track him after receiving that first big hit. Or as Hanzo's rage seems to reach its boiling point, he snaps through intense poses in an erratic motion, somewhat as one last attempt to scare Gon. Even as someone who had read the manga before and knew the outcome, I was still on the edge of my seat. I never expected such an emotional roller coaster, and this result comes from multiple different pieces coming together. Direction that gives a sense of gravitas to the key moments, a consistent stream of expressivity with the drawings that convince you of the pain or frustration these characters feel, a storyboard that holds depth and likewise comes together in expressing emotion, vibrant pieces of background art and lively animation on top. This is one of those episodes where every department harmonizes together. Min Sun Kim, or in the credits, Lim Mun Sun. It's clear his vision is quite different, and his choice of lighting makes that pretty obvious from the start, being quite bright and very much defining the atmosphere for this episode, that being a lighter and almost cheery one in some sense. In isolation, the colour palette is fine. It undoubtedly holds appeal, and I'm all for warm colours. However, for this moment, it does little in fitting with the tense atmosphere of the source material, as did the 99 version. Colours and lighting matter. Their ability to dictate the mood of a scene is no secret. It's why when Hanzo puts the blade to Gon's head, the palette and background change to an appropriately darker shade, or when Killua has his inner monologue moment, it's framed with a flat, dark background. And on a side note, it's unfortunate that's as far as any interesting creative choices go. Verbally, we're told there's nothing left for Gon to vomit. Killua makes mention of a brutal atmosphere, but visually the lighting choice sits in complete conflict with that. The writing says one thing but the visuals say another. This equally goes for track placement. Gon has been kicked to the ground and is in agony. Menchi narrates for a bit and ends by saying he's in danger. There's actually some tension, and ends with a dramatic close-up. Then it cuts to this. Like, what is this, Looney Tunes? In the 99 version it sounds like a horror movie track, and here we have a literal cartoon booing effect. When I first watched this, it caught me off guard and I was like, what was that? But honestly, I have to give it some credit for how humorous the placement is in retrospect. On a serious note, this isn't the only time of odd music placement. In the 99 version, as Hanzo puts the blade to Gon's head, a track suddenly begins. Composed of low-octave tones, it instantly gives this dense atmosphere as Hanzo's voice echoes throughout this room. The camera focuses in on each character, then back to Gon. As the blood slowly drips down his forehead staring straight at Hanzo, one of the show's main themes begins to play, as Gon explains his reason for coming this far and why he still won't back down. Of course, the atmosphere is strong visually, such as through those strong orange and pinkish hues, but it's the track selection by Sanaga which carries the other half of the weight. Kim's choices instead includes one with a slow flute. I personally don't think it's nearly as weighty, although it's undeniable a mysterious feel is somewhat present. but is that tonally appropriate? It suited Hanzo's flashback scene, which, also on a side note, used these very cartoony style designs for the ninjas with flash animation. It's a pretty jarring stylistic shift. Anyway, back to this moment, the use of purple is a nice choice to frame the importance of this moment, like I mentioned earlier, but then it switches to marching band music. This moment feels far flatter in comparison, and honestly flat is how I would describe the majority of tracks in this episode, with the exception of that spectacular one leading up to the match. Overall, most of them are simply generic and genuinely sound like something you would download off a website called freebeats.com. Of course, I'm not making a statement about the soundtrack as a whole, so please don't take it that way, but once again, with exception to one or two, the majority of the tracks on this episode are just okay at best. Now, I've been pretty harsh, so let's also bring some positivity, and that is the general consistency in character art. Both supervisors, Lee and Shin, keep the characters on model and are well drawn. Now, in terms of animation, unfortunately the staff list is composed of a lot of unknown names, so it's difficult to credit any scene to a particular animator. Although let's start from the same moment as we did prior with Matsumoto. It begins with a big zoom in, Master signals the fight to begin, Hanzo of course catches up and Gon is knocked down. What carries this scene here is character art and direction. The choice of a long zoom to start the scene works well, and the sudden palette swap out as Hanzo catches up to Gon goes well with expressing shock, and clearly gives an indication of the importance to this moment. The drawings, like I said before, are great, this episode isn't short of that, but it certainly is of actual animation. Everything presented here has just been stills with some lip flaps and minor twitching effects. There's nothing outright bad about stills, but when it comes to a key scene such as this, it's hardly as impactful. As Gon falls down in the 99 version, saliva is falling from his mouth, he closes and reopens both his eyes and mouth, with then several tears added. A basic twitching eye effect just doesn't carry that same level of weight. And unfortunately, this trend is present throughout this whole episode. As Hanzo grabs Gon, Matsumoto animates his head falling off to the side, showing that the character is barely conscious. And then as Hanzo talks, Gon's eyes begin to widen, he starts breathing slowly and still wobbling his head around in a daze. In 2011, there's nothing. It instead just cuts to after Hanzo's grabbed him with a basic twitching effect once more. In the 99 version, again, when Gon begins coughing, you can see his whole body moving up and down as the diaphragm expands and relaxes, before his breathing begins to steady. It's a realistic detail you don't all too often see, and especially in TV anime. With the 2011 take, it's just this, a slight head movement, and that's all, and there are countless more examples. As Leorio's frustration comes to its boiling point, he opens and clenches his fist. When Kurapika responds, his eye darts over. In 2011, it's again just twitching, it's static, and while the characters are drawn fine, lacks the same intensity. Then the later section after Gon's arm has been broken. He moves his knees back and forth in pain. It feels visceral and how someone would react. And a still drawing obviously doesn't give that same effect. With that said, an ambitious director can make up for a lack of animation with an imaginative storyboard that still evokes emotion. Once again though, that department is equally static. While Sanaga makes good use of extreme shots to establish Hanzo as a completely superior fighter, and a variety of others such as ground level, high angle, overhead, canted, first person, and many others in an effort to make those key narrative beats land, as well as making good use of layering with different characters or objects in a scene, establishing a sense of distance and with that depth to the environment. Kim's board, on the other hand, mostly relies on just basic eye-level shots. There might be something unique on occasion, but the majority of the time within those few times of deviation, it still feels flat in comparison. The storyboard simply lacks scale, and with interesting framing being absent on top of all that, it does absolutely nothing to camouflage the lack of animation. Now, it isn't unusual for episodes like this in TV anime, and especially a long-running one like Hunter x Hunter, there will always be quality drops. And before going further, I don't want to give the impression that this is an outright bad episode, but more so that it's simply unfortunate that with such a key one, it just couldn't feel any more like your generic shonen episode. I'm unsure of what upper level decisions in team management were made which led to this, but I'm glad at least one team did this spectacular moment justice. And with that concludes the video on Hunter x Hunter 99 vs Hunter x Hunter 2011. Alright, so thank you everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed it even if the positivity wasn't the whole way through, and if you could check out my Patreon, that would be most helpful. But with that, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.